I found Pinehaven Estates during a Sunday drive. Trees framed the entrance like nature's cathedral, and the moment I turned onto Oakwood Lane, something clicked inside of me. This neighborhood felt different from the dozens of cookie-cutter developments I had toured over the past 4 months. The homes had character. The lawns were immaculate without feeling sterile. People actually waved as I drove past. The realtor, Jessica, pulled into the driveway of what would become my home. "This just hit the market yesterday," she said, barely containing her excitement. "Five-bedroom main house on the front acre, plus 4 additional acres out back. Previous owner had plans drawn up for a workshop but never built it." I followed her through the house, admiring the hardwood floors and natural light, but it was the back door that captured my heart. Jessica slid it open and gestured toward the expansive backyard. Beyond the maintained portion lay acres of pristine woodland. "Property extends about a quarter-mile back," she explained. "There is a small access path along the side that leads to the cleared area where the workshop was planned." I walked to the edge of the manicured lawn, shielding my eyes from the sun as I gazed into the trees. My workshop. The dream I had carried for 20 years could finally become reality. I made an offer that afternoon, $15,000 above asking price to ward off competing bids. 3 days later, Jessica called with the news. "They accepted. Congratulations." I felt a wave of euphoria wash over me. After decades of apartment living and cramped rental homes, I would finally have space to breathe, space to create. The closing process moved quickly. I sat in a sterile conference room as the title company representative pushed document after document across the table. "Initial here, sign there." I barely registered the words as I scribbled my name. At one point the attorney paused, flipping to a specific page. "This property has an HOA," she mentioned casually. "Pretty standard stuff. Lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, the usual." I hesitated briefly. My previous experiences with homeowners associations had been less than pleasant. "Are they difficult?" I asked. The attorney smiled reassuringly. "Pinehaven is known for being hands-off. Basic standards to maintain property values, nothing crazy." She pointed to an unusual paragraph near the bottom of the page. "This is interesting, though. There is a special deed clause regarding property access rights and reversion of control." I skimmed it quickly, the legal jargon making my eyes glaze over. "Essentially, it ensures owners always have access to all portions of their property," she explained. "If access is ever restricted, control of the affected areas reverts to the property owner, outside of HOA jurisdiction." She flipped to the next page. "Not something you will ever need to worry about, but interesting historical quirk." I signed without a second thought, eager to complete the process and start moving. Moving day arrived with perfect weather. The movers unloaded my modest belongings into the spacious home while I walked the property boundaries. The main house sat proudly at the front, but my attention kept returning to the tree-lined path leading to the back acreage. I followed it, pushing through occasional overgrowth until the path opened to a natural clearing. Sunlight dappled through the canopy, illuminating the perfect spot for my workshop. The neighbors came by throughout that first week, welcoming me with baked goods and introductions. Tom and Sarah lived to my left, a retired couple who had been in Pinehaven for 15 years. "You will love it here," Sarah assured me, presenting a homemade apple pie. "Everyone looks out for each other." The Johnsons to my right brought a bottle of wine. Even the family across the street stopped by with a houseplant. During those first golden months, I settled into a rhythm. Weekdays devoted to unpacking and setting up the main house. Weekends spent clearing the access path to my back acreage and sketching workshop plans. I hired an architect to draft proper construction documents and began researching builders. The dream was taking shape, one small step at a time. I even received the HOA welcome packet, a thin folder containing community guidelines that seemed reasonable enough. I noted the monthly meeting schedule but felt no urgency to attend. Everything was falling into place perfectly, my paradise purchased, and slowly being shaped into the home I had always imagined. I had no idea that storm clouds were gathering just beyond the horizon of my perfect new beginning. The first HOA meeting I attended was held in the community center, a modest building at the entrance to Pinehaven Estates. I arrived 5 minutes early, but discovered the small conference room already packed with neighbors. I squeezed into a chair near the back, nodding politely to familiar faces. Precisely at 7 o'clock, a sharp-featured woman with an immaculate silver bob strode to the front of the room. The casual conversations immediately ceased. "Welcome, everyone," she announced, not bothering to look up from her notes. "I am Margaret Patterson, board president. Let us begin with property compliance updates." For the next hour, I watched Margaret systematically work through agenda items with military precision. Home exterior paint requests denied. Fence height exceptions refused. Landscaping variances rejected. Each decision delivered with a thin smile that never quite reached her eyes. The other board members barely spoke, nodding along as Margaret rendered judgment after judgment. "New business?" Margaret finally asked, glancing around the room. I hesitantly raised my hand, suddenly feeling like a schoolchild seeking permission to speak. Margaret acknowledged me with the barest tilt of her head. "I am new to the neighborhood," I began. "I wanted to introduce myself and mention that I plan to build a workshop on my back acreage in the coming months. I will submit formal plans once they are finalized." The room fell oddly silent. Margaret studied me with newfound interest. "Ah, the Reynolds property," she said, using the previous owner's name instead of mine. "That back section has been problematic in the past. All structures must comply with extensive aesthetic guidelines. I suggest you consult the full architectural review process before proceeding further." She moved briskly to the next agenda item, dismissing me without another word. As the meeting disbanded, Tom approached me, keeping his voice low. "Do not take it personally. Margaret runs this place like her personal kingdom." He glanced around before continuing. "She had quite the feud with Reynolds, something about that back property. Never did hear the whole story." The first citation appeared on my door the following Monday. "Mailbox height non-compliant with Section 4.2 of Community Guidelines. Correction required within 10 days." I measured my mailbox. It was precisely half an inch too low. I adjusted it that afternoon, bewildered by the pettiness but unwilling to cause trouble. 3 days later, another notice appeared. "Unauthorized plant species in front landscaping. Remove non-approved varieties within 7 days." The unauthorized species were the perennial flowers the previous owner had planted. I spent Saturday digging them up, replacing them with HOA-approved plants from the recommended list. "Margaret is putting you through the initiation," Sarah commented, watching me replace perfectly healthy flowers with nearly identical approved varieties. "She does this to all new residents, establishes her authority. Most people give in, and then the citations slow down." I tried to laugh it off, but the following week brought new violations. Trash cans visible from the street for more than 24 hours. Improper storage of garden hose. Edge of lawn exceeding grass height requirement by 1/4 inch. Each infraction more trivial than the last. Tom caught me measuring my grass with a ruler one evening. He chuckled sympathetically, leaning against his fence. "She is really giving you the full treatment." His expression grew more serious. "You should know. Margaret had it out for Reynolds, the previous owner of your place. Something about that back acreage access. Just watch yourself if you start doing any work back there." I nodded my thanks but privately dismissed his concerns. The citations were annoying but manageable. I had bigger priorities. The workshop plans were finalized, and I was eager to begin site preparation. That weekend, I rented a brush cutter and began clearing the somewhat overgrown access path to my back acreage. I had been working for less than an hour when a black SUV pulled up at the edge of my property. Margaret Patterson emerged, designer sunglasses obscuring her eyes. She stood silently, watching me work for several uncomfortable minutes before approaching. "What exactly are you doing?" she asked, voice clipped and formal. "Clearing the access path to my back acreage," I replied, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Just maintaining my property." Margaret pursed her lips. "This area borders community property. Any modifications require board approval." She surveyed the partially cleared path with obvious disapproval. "I suggest you cease work immediately pending proper review." I stood my ground, brush cutter still humming in my hands. "This path is entirely on my property according to the survey. I am simply maintaining an existing access way." Something cold flashed across Margaret's face. "We will see about that." She turned and walked back to her vehicle without another word. The certified letter arrived 3 days later, bearing the official HOA letterhead. I read it once, twice, then a third time, unable to believe the words. According to the HOA board, the 10-foot wide access path to my back acreage crossed a thin strip of community property, and therefore could not be modified, improved, or utilized without board approval, which had been unanimously denied. I stood at my property line that evening, staring at the now forbidden path to my own land, the workshop plans folded in my back pocket. The realization settled over me like a physical weight. This was not random harassment or petty power games. This was deliberate, targeted, and strategic. I felt something shift inside me, frustration hardening into determination. If Margaret wanted a fight over my right to access my own property, she had just found one. I decided to follow proper channels before escalating the situation. I completed the official HOA request forms, attaching my property survey clearly showing the access path within my property boundaries. I included photographs, county plat maps, and a formal letter requesting recognition of my right to access all portions of my property. The package was professionally bound, nothing left to chance. 2 weeks later, I stood before the HOA board in the crowded community center, presenting my case. I projected survey maps on the wall, highlighting property boundaries in clear, unmistakable lines. "As you can see from these official county documents," I explained, laser pointer tracing the path, "the access route falls entirely within my property lines. I am simply requesting confirmation of my right to use and maintain this existing path to access my back acreage." Margaret Patterson sat at the center of the board table, face impassive. When I finished, she tapped her pen against her notepad. "Thank you for your thorough presentation. However, according to community records, a 3-foot strip along that boundary was designated as a landscaping easement during development. The board maintains its position that modifications cannot be permitted due to aesthetic concerns and community standards." I blinked in confusion. "I would like to see documentation of this easement. It does not appear on any official county records." Margaret smiled thinly. "HOA records supersede county documentation in matters of community property. Your request is denied. Next item on the agenda." I stood frozen as the meeting moved on around me. The explanation made no legal sense, yet the other board members nodded along as if Margaret had delivered irrefutable logic. I gathered my materials and left, mind racing with questions and growing anger. The next morning, Susan Miller, one of the quieter board members, appeared at my door with a plate of cookies. "Thought you might need these after last night," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Once inside, her demeanor changed. "Listen, there is something you should know about that back acreage situation." She lowered her voice despite being inside my home. "Margaret has been working with Evergreen Development for months. They want to create a community garden project that would border your back acreage. If you cannot access your land, it makes their project much more attractive." Susan fidgeted with her watch. "I have said too much already. Please do not mention this conversation to anyone." She left quickly, leaving me stunned. The pieces were falling into place. This was not about community standards or aesthetic concerns. This was a calculated land grab. I consulted property records again, confirming what I already knew. There was no easement, no community strip. I owned the land outright, including the access path. I began photographing the area daily, documenting its current state, gathering evidence for what I knew would eventually become a legal battle. The following Tuesday morning, I awoke to the sound of engines. Through my kitchen window, I watched in disbelief as a construction crew unloaded equipment at the edge of my property. Before I could get dressed and confront them, metal posts were already being driven into the ground along the property line. I rushed outside, still in my robe. "What are you doing? This is my property." The foreman looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we have permits from the HOA to install community fencing. I suggest you take it up with them." By afternoon, an ornate but impenetrable 6-foot wrought iron fence stood precisely along my property line, blocking the only access to my back acreage. No gate, no opening, just a solid barrier between me and land that I legally owned. I immediately contacted a real estate attorney. Jackson Moore welcomed me into his wood-paneled office the following day, reviewing my documentation with growing concern. "This is highly unusual," he said, spreading the survey across his desk. "There is no question you own the property outright, including the access path." His finger traced the property lines on the survey. "However, without physical access, your back acreage becomes legally landlocked, essentially unusable." He leaned back in his chair, expression grave. "And after 7 years of being unable to access it, you could potentially lose rights to it entirely through adverse possession." My stomach dropped. 7 years, they are playing the long game. Attorney Moore nodded soberly. "It appears so. And unfortunately, HOAs have considerable power. Fighting them can be expensive and time-consuming." That night, I spread documents across my kitchen table as rain streamed down the windows. Property deed, HOA bylaws, meeting minutes I had requested through official channels. The evidence was there, hidden in plain sight. Margaret had systematically reorganized committee assignments months before I even moved in, ensuring her supporters controlled all access decisions. The board meeting where my request was denied had been decided long before I ever presented my case. I stared out the window at the new fence, barely visible in the darkness. This was about more than a workshop now. This was about justice, about fighting for what was rightfully mine. Property I had purchased, land I had paid for. I would not be bullied into submission by petty tyrants drunk on their own power. The workshop represented something bigger now, my right to stand against injustice, no matter how small or large the battle might be. I began my counterattack with research. If I was going to take on Margaret Patterson and her HOA empire, I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting against and what weapons might be available to me. The county record's office became my second home, a place of fluorescent lights and the comforting smell of aging paper. "Back again," Martha, the elderly clerk, greeted me with a knowing smile on my third consecutive visit. "Still digging into Pinehaven?" I nodded, spreading my notebook on the counter. "I need to see the original development plans. Not just my property, the entire neighborhood from inception." Martha disappeared into the labyrinth of filing cabinets, returning with a large cardboard box. "These go back 30 years, she said, lowering her voice. "Between you and me, Pinehaven has an unusual history. Not many people bother to look this far back." I spent hours poring over yellowed blueprints and faded documents. Pinehaven had been designed by a developer named Edward Harrington in the early 1990s. Unlike most cookie-cutter neighborhoods of that era, Harrington had created an unusual community structure with built-in protections for homeowners. "You know," Martha said during one of her check-ins, "Edward Harrington still lives just outside town, sharp as a tack despite being in his 80s now." 2 days later, I found myself sitting in Edward Harrington's sunroom, surrounded by framed photographs of Pinehaven in its early days. The developer was indeed sharp, his eyes alert and interested as I explained my situation. "Margaret Patterson," he said, shaking his head slowly. "She moved in about 15 years ago, started taking over committee by committee." He tapped a gnarled finger against the arm of his chair. "Not what we intended at all. We designed Pinehaven with balance in mind. The HOA was supposed to maintain standards, not become a fiefdom." I showed him the documents I had gathered, including the fence installation that had landlocked my back acreage. Harrington's expression darkened. "This is precisely what we sought to prevent," he said, reaching for a thick binder on a nearby shelf. "The original covenant has very specific protections." He flipped through pages with surprising dexterity until finding what he sought. "Here, Section 7.3. I leaned forward, reading the paragraph he indicated. It was the same clause the closing attorney had pointed out, the one I had dismissed as an interesting historical quirk. Now, the words seemed to glow with significance. "We included this failsafe for exactly this situation," Harrington explained. "If the HOA ever prevents an owner from accessing their property, control of that specific area reverts to the property owner, removing it from HOA jurisdiction entirely." I read the passage repeatedly, heart racing. "This is still valid, legally enforceable." Harrington nodded firmly. "Absolutely. It is written into the master deed that established Pinehaven. No HOA bylaw can supersede it." He closed the binder. "You will need a specialized attorney, someone who understands HOA law specifically. This is not a common provision, but it was intentional and binding." The following day, I met with Elaine Winters, an attorney specializing in homeowner association disputes. Her office was modern and bright, a stark contrast to Jackson Moore's traditional space. "This clause is extraordinary," she said after reviewing my documents, excitement barely contained. "The founders included a powerful fail-safe mechanism that most developments lack." She leaned forward, eyes bright with strategic thinking. "If we can prove the HOA deliberately cut off your access to your own property, the clause automatically triggers." "What exactly happens if it triggers?" I asked. "The specific area in question, in this case, the access path and possibly the back acreage itself, would revert to your exclusive control. The HOA would lose all jurisdiction over that portion of your property." She tapped the survey map. "No more approval needed. No more interference permitted. It would essentially create an HOA-free zone within your property boundaries." She outlined the procedure with careful precision. "We would need extensive documentation of the blockade, testimony from the original developer about the clause's intent, and formal filing with county authorities. The HOA would fight back, of course. Margaret would not surrender control easily. That night, I stood at my kitchen window, staring out at the fence silhouetted against the evening sky. The path beyond my path led to land I legally owned but could not touch. The workshop plan sat on my counter, a dream temporarily deferred. I understood now the magnitude of what lay ahead, not just reclaiming access to my land, but potentially changing the power structure that had controlled this community for years. The clause represented something larger than my personal battle. It was about honoring the original vision of Pinehaven, restoring balance between community standards and individual rights. I felt a strange sense of purpose settling over me. This fight was worth having, not just for me, but for every homeowner who had ever felt powerless against arbitrary rules and petty tyrants. My dining room transformed into command central over the next few weeks. Survey maps covered the walls. Property documents filled labeled folders. Photographs of the fence and blocked access path were arranged chronologically, showing the deliberate nature of the blockade. Attorney Winters had been clear. Our case needed to be airtight before formally invoking the clause. They will fight back with everything they have, she warned during our strategy session. Margaret Patterson will not surrender control easily. I began quietly reaching out to neighbors who had shown sympathy to my situation. Tom and Sarah were the first to visit, slipping into my home after dark like conspirators in a spy novel. "We have been waiting for someone to stand up to her," Sarah confessed, accepting a cup of coffee. "She has gone too far for too long." Tom nodded in agreement. "She fined us 3 times last year for excessive holiday decorations. Our grandchildren love the Christmas lights." He reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded paper. "I brought something that might help. Aerial photographs of the neighborhood from 5 years ago, before I retired from the county surveyor office. You can clearly see your access path here, completely unobstructed." Other neighbors followed. The Johnsons brought documentation of arbitrary fines. Susan Miller provided copies of board meeting minutes she had secretly recorded, revealing discussions about blocking my access path weeks before the fence installation. Each visitor shared their own story of Margaret's tyranny: denied renovations, personal vendettas, selectively enforced rules. "She rejected our patio extension 3 times, said Michael Rodriguez, who lived near the community center. Then approved an identical design for her friend across the street the following month. The official surveyor arrived on a Tuesday morning, his GPS device beeping methodically as we walked my property line. He marked coordinates with fluorescent flags, taking measurements and photographs for his official report. "The fence is precisely on the property line," he confirmed, making notes on his clipboard. "No encroachment either way, but it deliberately blocks the only feasible access to your back acreage." He looked up from his notes. "In my professional opinion, this creates a textbook case of an artificially landlocked parcel." Attorney Winters reviewed our growing portfolio later that week, nodding with increasing confidence as she examined each piece of evidence. "The clause is clear, the violation well documented," she confirmed, tapping the binder we had assembled. "I believe we have enough to proceed." Edward Harrington, despite his age, readily agreed to provide testimony about the intent behind the provision. "This is exactly why we included it," he said during our preparation meeting, his voice stronger when discussing his creation. "To prevent power-hungry boards from abusing their authority." As the pieces fell into place, we prepared the formal documents required to invoke the clause: certified letters to the HOA board, legal notification to the county record's office, a complete evidence package supporting our claim that access had been deliberately restricted. For our final preparation, Attorney Winters arranged a special meeting at her office. She brought in a retired judge who had presided over HOA disputes for 20 years to review our case and conduct a mock proceeding. "You have an unusually strong position," he concluded after 3 hours of intense questioning. "The clause is clearly written, properly filed with the original covenant, and the violation is well documented. In my assessment, you should prevail." The night before our scheduled presentation at the emergency board meeting, I stood at the edge of my property, looking out at the land I legally owned but could not touch. Tomorrow, everything would change. I checked my phone one last time, confirming our scheduled presentation. Sleep eluded me as I mentally rehearsed every word, every piece of evidence, every possible objection. I had prepared for this moment for weeks, but still felt the nervous energy coursing through me. By morning, the butterflies in my stomach had transformed into steely resolve. I dressed carefully in professional attire, loaded the evidence binders into my car, and drove to meet Attorney Winters at her office. The pieces were in place. The documentation was airtight. Now came the confrontation I had both dreaded and anticipated for months. The emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. in the community center. By 6:30, the room was already packed with residents. Word had spread throughout Pine Haven, something significant was happening tonight. Neighbors nodded encouragingly as I entered with Attorney Winters by my side, wheeling a small cart of evidence binders. Edward Harrington sat near the back, dignified and determined despite his age. At precisely 7:00, Margaret Patterson strode into the room, flanked by the other board members. She took her seat at the center of the table, arranging her papers with practiced efficiency. If she was concerned about the unusual attendance or my attorney's presence, she showed no sign of it. "This emergency meeting is called to order," she announced, not bothering with pleasantries. "We have one agenda item tonight. The board will hear from the property owner at 42 Oakwood Lane regarding an alleged covenant dispute." Her emphasis on alleged made her position clear before I had spoken a single word. Attorney Winters and I approached the podium. The room fell into expectant silence as my attorney distributed our evidence binders to each board member. Margaret accepted hers with visible reluctance. "Good evening," I began, voice steadier than I expected. "I come before the board tonight regarding a serious matter that affects not just my property rights, but the founding principles of Pine Haven Estates." I activated the projector, displaying my property survey with the blocked access clearly marked. 6 months ago, this board authorized the installation of a fence that completely blocks the only access to my back acreage. This action was taken despite clear evidence that the access path lies entirely within my property boundaries. Methodically, I presented the evidence we had gathered. Photographs of the access path before and after the fence installation. County records confirming my ownership. Meeting minutes revealing the board's deliberate strategy to block my access. "This blockade was not accidental," I continued, advancing to the next slide. "It represents a deliberate attempt to render a significant portion of my property unusable." Margaret interrupted, voice sharp with authority. "This fence installation was properly approved through community architectural review. It complies with all HOA guidelines for perimeter fencing." Attorney Winters stepped forward. "That is not in dispute, Ms. Patterson. The fence itself may comply with guidelines. The issue is its strategic placement and the resulting consequence deliberately cutting off access to my client's legally owned property." I took a deep breath, moving to the critical portion of our presentation. Which brings us to Section 7.3 of the original Pinehaven Covenant. The room grew even quieter. I displayed the clause on the projector screen, the text enlarged for all to see. This provision, included by the original developers, clearly states that if an HOA ever prevents an owner from accessing their property, control of that specific area reverts to the property owner, removing it from HOA jurisdiction entirely. Margaret's dismissive smile froze as the implications became clear. The other board members exchanged uncertain glances, several opening their binders to review the provision. "I am formally invoking Section 7.3, I stated, voice clear and firm. Due to the deliberate blockade of access to my back acreage, I am exercising my right to have control of the access path revert to my exclusive ownership, free from HOA jurisdiction." The projector switched to photographs of the blocked access, property surveys with the landlocked portion highlighted in angry red. Edward Harrington rose slowly from his seat in the back, commanding attention as he approached the front of the room. "I am Edward Harrington, original developer of Pinehaven Estates," he announced, voice carrying surprising strength. "I personally included Section 7.3 in the founding covenant to prevent exactly this type of abuse of power. No homeowner should ever be cut off from their legally owned property by HOA overreach." Margaret's face hardened. She abruptly stood, gathering her papers. "This meeting is adjourned for legal consultation," she declared, voice sharp with barely controlled anger. "The board needs to consult counsel before responding to these accusations." Attorney Winters remained calm. "You may certainly seek legal advice, Ms. Patterson. However, I must inform you that the invocation has already been filed with county authorities this morning. The process has formally begun." The room erupted, board members whispering urgently to each other, homeowners murmuring in surprise and interest. Margaret remained standing, color rising in her cheeks. "This is a direct attack on community standards and property values," she exclaimed, pointing directly at me. "An attempt to circumvent the authority granted to this board by the homeowners." But something had shifted in the room. Board member James Wilson studied the documentation, forehead creased in concentration. Susan Miller openly questioned the fence installation process, noting that proper notification procedures had not been followed. Even Margaret's closest allies appeared uncomfortable, glancing nervously between their leader and the mounting evidence. The turning point came when Attorney Winters placed a call to the county clerk's office, putting it on speakerphone for all to hear. "This is the county recorder's office," announced a professional voice. "We confirm receipt of filing number 78,429, invoking Covenant Section 7.3 for the property at 42 Oakwood Lane, Pinehaven Estates." Margaret's composure finally cracked. She gathered her papers with jerky movements, eyes flashing with anger. "You have no idea who you are dealing with," she hissed as she prepared to leave. "This is far from over." But her threat sounded hollow in the suddenly changed atmosphere of the room. Board members were now physically distancing themselves from her side of the table, the balance of power visibly shifting before our eyes. Homeowners who had suffered silently under Margaret's regime for years were sitting straighter, whispering to each other with new energy and hope. As the meeting dissolved into clusters of animated conversation, Attorney Winters and I gathered our materials. "Phase 1 complete," she said quietly. "Now we wait for the county's official determination." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The battle was not over, but for the first time since the fence appeared, I felt genuine hope. The clause existed for a reason, and tonight, That reason had been powerfully demonstrated to the entire community. The official county decision arrived 3 weeks later. The envelope bore the county seal, its contents determining the outcome of our months-long struggle. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it in Attorney Winter's office. The legal language was unmistakably clear. After thorough review of all submitted documentation and relevant covenants, the County Recorder's Office confirms the validity and applicability of Section 7.3 of the Pinehaven Estates Master Covenant. Control of the designated access path and surrounding 5 feet on either side reverts to the exclusive ownership of the property owner at 42 Oakwood Lane, free from homeowners association jurisdiction. Attorney Winters smiled broadly. "Congratulations, you won." The fence removal crew arrived the following Monday. Under bright blue skis, they systematically dismantled the barrier that had symbolized so much more than mere metal and iron. Each post extracted felt like a personal victory. Neighbors gathered to watch the process, some openly celebrating, others simply observing the physical manifestation of change in their community. Margaret Patterson was conspicuously absent. Her resignation from the HOA board had been announced via terse email the previous evening. The message contained no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a notification that she would be stepping down effective immediately for personal reasons. When the crew finished, I stood alone at the entrance to the now clear access path. Taking a deep breath, I walked the length of it for the first time in months. My steps felt ceremonial, significant. The back acreage opened before me, sunlight filtering through trees that had waited patiently for my return. The foundation markers for my workshop were still there, small wooden stakes defining the outline of a dream temporarily deferred but never abandoned. The emergency HOA election was held 2 weeks later. The community center buzzed with energy unlike any previous meeting. Record attendance filled every chair, with residents standing along the walls. The nominating committee presented their slate of candidates, with Susan Miller unanimously endorsed for president. "My platform is simple," Susan announced to enthusiastic applause. "Transparency, fairness, and remembering that the HOA exists to serve homeowners, not control them." The election was decisive. The new board's first official action was establishing clear guidelines preventing future access restrictions and creating a formal appeals process for all homeowner disputes. The second was initiating a complete review of all fines and violations issued during Margaret's tenure, with a process for appropriate refunds where warranted. Spring arrived with new beginnings. Construction equipment rumbled down my newly graveled access road. The workshop foundation was poured as wildflowers bloomed along the borders of my accessible land. Tom and Sarah brought lunch to the construction crew on the first day, a small celebration of victory. "You did more than build a workshop," Tom commented, watching the workers set forms for the concrete. "You changed the entire neighborhood." By summer, the workshop was taking shape, a sturdy structure of wood and stone that blended naturally with the surrounding landscape. The space would be everything I had envisioned: woodworking area, pottery studio, peaceful retreat. But it had become something more as well, a symbol of perseverance against injustice. The revised HOA covenant, with strengthened homeowner protections, passed unanimously at the July meeting. Section 7.3 remained intact, its importance now recognized and respected by all residents. Additional provisions were added to prevent any future